Well, good afternoon, everybody. And if you're looking for the Building Healthy Foundations in the Early Years webinar, you're in the right place. So my name is Claire Theobald, and I'm Education Services Manager at the British Nutrition Foundation. We're really delighted to have you with us this afternoon. And we're really thrilled to have Catherine Lipp with us today. So Catherine is an experienced early years nutritionist, and we're going to do this session together. So I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping with you, and then I'm going to hand over to Catherine, who's going to talk to you from a nutritionist perspective, and then it's going to come back to me, and I'm going to sort of bookend Catherine's session by just pointing in the direction of some of our early years resources. So just a little mini bit of housekeeping. We're going to record this webinar, so you'll be able to come back to it afterwards. We'll also share certainly slides with the links to other resources and things, so you don't need to worry about scribbling down where to find some of the FFL resources, because you'll have the presentations with the links. If you have any questions while we're going along, we'll probably hang on to those until the end. So if you can just keep them in mind, or pop them in the chat if you're worried you're going to forget them, and we'll come back to those at the end. And then right when we've finished, we'll be sharing a link to an evaluation. So there's a QR code for that on the screen now if you wanted to get it set up on your phone, and we'll do another QR at the end, and we'll also put a link in the chat box. So if you can spare us just a minute to evaluate the session at the end, that's really helpful for us going forward and planning our training programme. And then once you've completed the evaluation, you'll be able to download a certificate. So that's great for your professional development records and so on. So just a quick skim over what we're covering today. So our session's really all about promoting positive attitudes to food. So Catherine's going to start off working with that. So looking at building healthier food foundations during the early years, and strategies as well to support food acceptance and say these positive attitudes towards food. And then we'll show you our resources on Food Factor Life that you can marry with those messages from Catherine to really support the young people in your settings. So I'll stop there and hand my screen over now to Catherine.
Great, thank you, Claire, and welcome everybody to our webinar this afternoon. I'm just going to share my screen with you, and hopefully everybody can see that okay.
Yeah, that looks great.
Perfect, thanks, Claire. Love it when things work correctly. Yes, so as Claire said, my name is Catherine Lipp. I am an early years nutritionist, and can you still see my screen okay?
Yes, we can. Yep.
You can. Okay, perfect.
All good.
Fantastic. I'm an early years nutritionist, and I specialise in... Are you still there?
We're still here. The screen's gone black.
Oh, sorry. I don't know what... You're back? Okay, perfect. I just said, didn't I? I love it when things work and then my computer turned off or my screen went blank.
You tested fate there, didn't you?
Yeah, I did, didn't I? Right, let's crack on before something else happens. But yeah, my name's Catherine Lipp. I am a registered nutritionist specialising in early years. And I'm going to talk to you specifically this afternoon about exactly, as Claire said, kind of developing those positive relationships with food, how to handle some of those really tricky scenarios where children very typically at this age in the early years might struggle with food acceptance, particularly of new foods. So we're going to talk about some practical things that you can do in your early years settings to support those children. Now, the first thing to consider is setting the foundations around your mealtime. So what I want you to think about is consider how your environment supports children's development, supports their relationship with food. And getting that mealtime environment right can really make the difference between a slightly chaotic and stressful eating occasion or a calm and productive one. So some of the things that you might be able to do in your setting or in your nursery or in your home if you're a childminder to create a positive mealtime environment might include things like removing the distractions, reducing the amount of noise that there is as well. For some children, that can be a big distraction. So meal times in themselves are quite an activity and will require children to focus on what's going on around them. We want children to benefit from that exposure to food. So if we can make sure that toys and activities from a previous session are cleared away, then that can really help to stop their attention wandering and can be helpful, particularly for those reluctant eaters, to allow them that exposure, to allow them to focus a little bit more on the food that they're presented with, even if they're not quite ready to try it yet. So removing distractions is one thing. Making mealtimes a bit of an occasion as well. So think about how your table is set up, using things like tablecloths or placemats, or some settings I've worked with have had sort of a paper flower display in the middle of the table or decorations to make it a little bit more inviting for those children when they come to the table. You can get children involved in that as well. So they could potentially decorate their own placemats or make the paper flowers, and encourage them to be part of that setting up the mealtime as well. So helping to lay the table with cutlery or cups or plates. Sometimes if children have had some input into that mealtime setup, they might be more likely then to take part and be willing to explore that food. So that's something else you can consider in your settings if you're not doing so already. Something else that's quite useful is to prepare a child's sensory system for the mealtime. Food and eating is a very sensory heavy activity. There's a lot of sensory information to process. So, helping children to prepare for that, giving them an advanced warning, having a structured routine, and potentially doing an activity before they come to the table to help their sensory system prepare for that can be really helpful, particularly for some children, again, who are more reluctant around certain foods. So things like, having a good old dance or doing some star jumps for a few minutes before they come to the table can be a really good way to help just regulate their nervous system and help them to come to that table a little bit more prepared. The other thing that's really useful to think about is the seating position for children. So making sure that children have the right postural stability and support whilst they're eating can really, again, make the difference between a positive mealtime experience or a more challenging one for them. And what I would recommend is that you look at your seating position for the children. What we're looking for ideally is having a 90-degree angle at their hips, at their knees, and their ankles. So having some sort of foot support for children is really helpful. If they've got something sturdy and secure to rest their feet on, it really helps to take the pressure off their core. It can reduce what we call postural fatigue, which is essentially just getting tired and fidgety in their chair, and can really make the difference with their attention and their focus at meal times. I would also encourage you to think about kind of the utensils, the cutlery, the plates, the bowls that you're using at meal times as well. So, giving children appropriate cutlery that fits the size of their mouth, that they can handle really easily, is also really important. And, from around, depending on their developmental stage, usually from around 10 or 11 months, babies can be encouraged to self feed. So, don't be afraid to encourage self feeding as soon as a child is showing their developmental readiness to do so. Using knives and forks, giving them the right tools is really helpful to support their motor skills, but also to allow them to feel competent in eating as well. So how can we expect them to learn how to cope with different foods and different textures if we don't give them the right tools or utensils to practice with? So that's something else to think about as well. I'd also encourage you to consider the length of your meal times as well. It can be really tempting to keep children at the table for as long as they need to try a few mouthfuls or to get a few spoonfuls of food in them. But actually, children don't have very long attention spans at this age, and you'll know that much better than me, being experts in childcare and early years education. But actually, what I would generally say is keeping mealtime short. So depending on the size of your setting and how many children you're feeding, around 15 to 20 minutes, maybe a little longer if you've got lots of children seated at the meal time. That's probably the ideal length of time for your meal times. In a setting. If children are sat at the table much longer than that, they're likely to become uninterested in the food, become distracted. And actually, what we want to do is make sure that children don't go away from the mealtime feeling frustrated or feeling bored or feeling anxious. So sometimes it's a case of the longer we leave them at the table in the hope that they'll eat something, they can become more frustrated and more disengaged with food and with meal times. And that's something we want to avoid doing. So that's sort of the environment setup. Another concept that I talk a lot about with early years practitioners when it comes to feeding, and you may have heard this term of responsive feeding. Responsive feeding is basically an approach that allows us to tune in to the child's internal cues. So this is sort of the official definition, if you like, of responsive feeding. So it's an approach to feeding that facilitates the discovery or the rediscovery of internal cues, curiosity, and motivation to eat, whilst building a child's skills and confidence. It's a flexible approach. It prioritizes the feeding relationship rather than focusing on how much the child is eating. And it respects and develops child's autonomy, their choice over how much they want to eat, essentially. And if we think about it, when babies are born, we're very good at following a responsive feeding approach. So newborn babies, we have an environment where the baby cries to indicate that they want some food. We feed them. So that's their sort of communication. A child will communicate through words, sounds, expressions, or body language. So with a baby, that's a crying for food, and the parent responds to that request, responds to those communication skills. We feed them, and then the baby will stop feeding when they are satisfied, when they've had enough. And particularly if you're breastfeeding, you don't necessarily know how much food they've had or how much milk they've had. But we are very good at remaining in tune and with the baby's cues and signals and following their lead. And that's essentially what a responsive feeding approach is. What tends to happen is as children grow older, we start to follow a little bit more non-responsive feeding practices, a bit more controlling potentially, a bit more carer-led or parent-led feeding practices. We might sort of pressure, persuade, coerce a child to eat. And actually, what that can do, those non responsive, more controlling feeding practices, is it can actually interrupt the child's self regulation and might lead to more avoidant eating, even though it comes from a good place and we're trying to encourage that child to eat well. If we're not responding to the child's cues, it can actually lead to more food refusal if the child is experiencing that. So with responsive feeding, what we want to do is create that environment that we've just talked about, a comfortable, calm, engaged environment where we've got the right utensils, we've got the right seating position, we've got an inviting environment. And we look out for the child's communication signals again. So we're looking at their body language, how they're responding to their food. Are they asking for more? Are they saying no, they don't want to try it? Are they using body language or sounds? It could just be that they're turning away from the food, they're arching away, they're pushing spoons away. It's important for us to notice those signals. That's the children communicating with you. And we want to respond not in a controlling, directive way where we're trying to override that and say, no, you must have a few more spoonfuls, where we're trying to be in control, but we're trying to respond in a way that is timely, it's emotionally supportive, it's related to the child's communication, it's appropriate to the child's developmental stage, and so that child experiences a response that they were anticipating. We're listening to them essentially, and we are responding. And what that means, going back to what I was talking about a little bit earlier on is the child is more likely then to have a positive interaction with that food, even if they've not explored a new food or they've not tasted it or tried it yet. They are more likely to remember that interaction with that food. They're more likely to remember that meal time as being a positive experience. And therefore, when they are faced with that food again, they're more likely to go a step further, to explore that food further, than if we have tried to put too much pressure on them, if we've tried to override their communication signals and sort of coerce them to eat more than they're indicating they want. So that's something to think about in terms of the responsive feeding approach. And there are a few key things that we need to focus on if we want to establish this responsive feeding approach. There's a few key things I'm going to go through with you which really feed into that responsive feeding approach. And one of that is autonomy, which essentially is choice. And this saying here is something that I really like to use with early years practitioners. You are in charge of what the food is. So you're in charge of your menu, you're in charge of the routine, so you're in charge of when that food is served, and you're also in charge of where. So your responsibility as an early years provider is what, when, and where that food is offered. But the child is to decide how much, if any, of that food they want to eat. So you provide, the child decides. And actually, this is really supporting that child's autonomy. So autonomy is a really important aspect of really positive, to support that positive relationship with food. It's something that we should nurture. And if we can get that right, it can have really important positive implications for that child's feeding development, for enjoyable meal times, for the facilitation of that kind of relaxed, calm atmosphere, which can support food acceptance, rather than that sort of more pressureful approach where we feel we should be in charge of how much they're eating or how much they're trying. So remember, you provide and the child decides. The other key thing to think about is understanding appetite. Sorry, I'm not sure what my computer's doing. Can you still see my slides there?
Yeah, just a temporary black, but it's back to colour again now.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure why that's happening. I'm going to make sure all my cables are plugged in correctly. So the other key thing to think about is understanding appetite. And there are many things that will affect a child's appetite. And again, this is why it's really important to respond to a child's cues, because we might not necessarily appreciate what is going on with their appetite. They could be feeling a little bit under the weather. For young children, they might be teething. This hot weather, you might have noticed that a lot of your children in this heat wave, their appetite has been affected. That can be a huge factor in the summer, particularly with very extreme temperatures like we've been experiencing recently. If they have had lots of snacks or drinks throughout the day, or potentially even before they've arrived at your setting, that can be useful for you to understand what else they are getting, which might be impacting their appetite. Things like tiredness, anxiety, mood, change to a routine if they're in a setting where they are moving or transitioning from a different room or to a new setting. All of these things can affect a child's appetite. And there is nothing more erratic than a toddler's appetite or a young child's appetite. So again, it's not necessarily the case that we will see with young children's appetite that it's a very linear, as they get older, they eat more and more. It's much more of a roller coaster. And that's why, again, it's really important to allow a child to be in tune with their appetite, to respond to their cues. And what will tend to happen is if they do go through a period of low appetite for any of these reasons, generally the next few weeks they will make up for it, or the next few days they will make up for it, and their appetite will increase. So it's almost a case of riding it out and just acknowledging that there are many things that can affect a child's appetite that we need to be aware of and be respectful of, and respond to their cues. Allow them to be in charge of their own internal cues when it comes to hunger and fullness. And some of the signs that children might show or demonstrate that indicate that they are full, they might tell you, they might verbally communicate with you if they're able to, that they don't want to eat anymore. They might turn their head away from the spoon, clench their mouth shut, spit the food out. They might hold the food in their mouth and not swallow it. This is something we call food pocketing. Any of these things can be an indicator, can be some of those signs and signals of communication that the child doesn't want to eat that particular food at that time. And what we want to do is almost put ourselves in the child's shoes. How might it make you feel if you weren't hungry, you didn't want to eat a particular food, but you were being pressured to have just one more mouthful and will not leave the table until you try this particular food or until you've had 3 mouthfuls. It's a really important thing to think about when we're focusing on this responsive feeding. So it's a case of looking out for these signs and signals, respecting them, responding to them appropriately, and remembering that children, with your routine, children will have lots of opportunities to eat across the day. Those snacks in between meals are a really important top up, and that's exactly what they're there for. So if a child hasn't eaten particularly well at lunchtime, for example, you will have an afternoon snack or tea coming up later on, and that's their opportunity to top up and make up for anything that they have missed out on earlier on. Competency is something else that we want to think about a little bit. And again, this is one of the key things that feeds into a responsive feeding approach. Does the child feel like a competent eater? Sometimes it can be so easy when children are eating that we are trying to correct them. We're trying to tell them to have one more mouthful. We might be constantly wiping their mouth when they are eating. That sort of correction, that adjustment, even the labeling of calling a child a fussy eater in front of them can make them feel like they're not a competent eater. And actually, learning to eat is a really complex skill. Like I mentioned earlier, there are so many sensory steps to eating. It's really sensory overwhelming. And just like a child is learning any other new skill, we want to provide the right tools, the right environment, the right sort of nurturing approach to support them through that. So we want them to make them feel like a competent and a confident eater rather than correcting them all the time. So we want to think in that respect a little bit about some of those environmental things we talked about at the beginning. Have they got a comfortable, supportive feeding environment with a appropriate seating position? Have they got the right tools and utensils? I've seen in some scenarios young children trying to eat with an adult-sized dessert spoon, and it's too big, it's too uncomfortable for their mouth. Things like that, little adjustments can make all the difference when it comes to feeding. So we want to make sure that both the food in terms of its texture and its style, and also the utensils that we're providing are appropriate to that child's developmental stage, so that they don't risk feeling frustrated or incompetent when it comes to feeding. Something else which again really supports that responsive feeding approach, that autonomy that you provide, the child decides, is what I call family style serving. And essentially this is where we avoid plating up the food for the child. We place all of the food that you might be serving in the center of the table. The child starts with an empty plate, and the child is encouraged to self-serve from those central serving dishes. And what's really nice about this is that it supports various elements of developmental skills, those fine motor skills or gross motor skills. It will allow children to be exposed to foods that maybe they haven't come across before, or maybe they are very reluctant to eat, in the center of the table without having them directly in their space. For some children, particularly reluctant eaters, if we pre-plate their food for them, we've taken some of that decision away from them. So we've reduced that autonomy, we've reduced that choice, and we've decided what we think should go on their plate for them. And in some instances, for children who are particularly reluctant, that can make mealtimes feel incredibly challenging. It can make the rest of their plate feel contaminated with this one new food that's on there that they don't like, and they don't want it anywhere near them. They certainly don't want it touching their accepted foods. And so what happens then is they start to get anxious and frustrated, and we reduce the likelihood of them eating anything at all. If we've got all of those foods placed in the center of the table and the child is allowed to decide what goes onto their plate, they have that choice, they have that autonomy, they feel competent because they are allowed to decide what goes onto their plate, and they can still benefit from the exposure to new foods without that risk of what we call contamination, food contamination of the accepted foods on their plate. Now, of course, when you're doing this, you need to be careful in your settings of children's dietary requirements and supervise to ensure that children aren't putting foods on their plate that they can't have. But it can be a really useful method of serving your food, which supports that autonomy, supports competency, and really helps to build that positive relationship with food. There's a really nice element of sort of sharing and connecting over food when we use this approach, with sort of calmness and security for that child as well. So that's a really nice approach with your meal times. Role modeling is also a really key aspect of your meal times. We know that children love to copy, so it's really important that they see good role models eating a variety of different foods. You are fantastic role models in your settings. Even if you aren't eating the same food as the children, you can still be a really good role model. And it's just really paying attention to everything, even your sort of body language. It's important to sort of forget your own dislikes or preconceptions about food. I've been in many a setting where the staff might not particularly enjoy something like fish, and fish dishes can be quite smelly in particular. And it's really hard for some of those practitioners to contain their dislike for the smell or the appearance of that food. But remember that even things like your body language, a little subtle screwing up of the nose can make all the difference to those children. So really thinking about that, and your conversation as well. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some mealtime language examples to be wary of. But when you're eating with children, your conversation doesn't always have to be focused on food, particularly if you've got very anxious children around new foods. We want, again, those meal times to be a comfortable, calm environment, a comfortable, calm, positive experience for the child. It's focusing on connection. We don't have to always talk specifically about the food. Sometimes just talking about the day, the activities that you've been doing this morning, what you're going to be doing later on, can be more helpful than constantly focusing on the food. Particularly for those very reluctant eaters, where if we're always talking about the food, it can increase their frustration, their anxiety. So sometimes actually non-food talk can be a good way to reduce that anxiety, still focus on connection and conversation and calmness, but we don't always have to talk about food. So in terms of your language, there's some really subtle things here that I think are quite helpful to point out. And again, this really just feeds into everything we've talked about so far. What we want to do is to try and keep language as neutral as possible when we're talking about food, avoiding kind of opinions such as, you know, oh, it's really yummy, I really like it. I would encourage you to actually remain more factual about the foods, focusing on things like colour, texture, temperature, smell, taste. You know, you can get creative with your and imaginative with your conversations as well, but try to avoid asking lots of questions. When children are facing something new, because it is such a sensory experience for them, a challenging sensory experience, if we ask lots of questions, things like, you know, do you like it? Why don't you try? Can you have 3 more mouthfuls? Asking all those questions is quite pressureful to begin with, but it's also something else for the child to have to focus on, something else for them to have to process and then answer you. So instead of saying things like, do you like it? which is not a bad thing to say, but for some children it can be it can feel pressureful, and it's another thing for them to process. Like I say, I would try to focus more on the factual appearances, or the factual sensory characteristics of that food. So instead of saying, do you like it, you might say something like, the pasta is warm and smells like tomatoes. And what that does is, rather than sort of the child having to answer a question about whether they like the pasta or not, before they've even tried it, you are giving them some sensory information. You are describing what that food feels like, what it smells like. They therefore have some sort of anticipation of what that food might feel like in their mouth when they're ready to try it. And you've likened it to tomatoes. So if they're familiar with that, they've got some sort of anticipation of how it's going to taste. Instead of asking a child to try something, which puts a little bit of pressure on them, one of the best things you can do is actually say to them, you can leave the cucumber on the plate today if you don't want to try it. And what you've done there is you've taken that pressure away. You've allowed that child autonomy, control over whether they want to eat it or not. So the decision is theirs, and they know, okay, I don't have to eat it if I don't want to today. It's about, you provide, they decide. Instead of saying things like, there's no pudding or second course until you've tried the broccoli, again, that's adding pressure. You're putting negotiations or boundaries around that food. You can focus on the fun, imaginative, creative side of that food. So, oh, this piece of broccoli looks like a tree. It's playful. You're talking about the characteristics of that broccoli. You're making it fun. You're making it enjoyable. And it comes back to what we were talking about earlier on, that the child is going to remember that interaction with food more positively if we take that pressure off and we're much more factual, or we allow them to decide whether they're eating it or not. I won't go through all of these examples. These slides will be shared with you, so you can have a look at these in your own time if you want to. But one that I will point out is the praise one as well. So praise can be really great for children of this age. Again, you will know that much better than I do. In terms of those very reluctant eaters or those very anxious eaters, praise can also be interpreted a little bit like pressure. So saying something like, well done, you've eaten so well, it can feel like, I've done it once, I'm going to be expected to do it every time now. And it can be interpreted as pressure. So instead of saying something like that, I would almost change that around slightly. So you're actually not praising it, but you're validating the action. It's more of a neutral observation, such as, I heard some loud crunching there. It's more of a factual observation. You're acknowledging what the child has done without adding the pressure on. So some really subtle changes, which are particularly applicable to those children who are more reluctant or more anxious eaters, that might just give you a little bit of food for thought, pardon the pun there, about how to conduct those meal times and what you can do to support children in your settings with that language as well. So that's it from me. I'm going to stop sharing and I will hand over to Claire. And as we said earlier, if you do have questions, please do pop them in the chat box or the Q&A box, and we will come to them at the end of the session this afternoon.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Catherine. That was another brilliant session, really informative, and so many ideas and strategies there. So it's really, really, really engaging listening to you speak about it all. I know some people are asking if they would get the slides and the recording afterwards. Yes, we will have a recording online, so you can watch that or share that with colleagues, so they can benefit from the information as well. So I'll just do a short session now just on some of the materials on the Food Effect to Life website. And then if there are any questions, I know someone was asking a question about young people with SEND, so we'll come back to those at the end. But if you think of anything else while we're going along, pop those in the chat and then we can pick those up in a few minutes. So I'm just briefly going to tell you a little bit about Food Effect to Life. So some of you will know us already. It's our education programme, and it's for children and young people from 3 up to 16 years, for those people who are working with young people those ages. stages, and it's run by the British Nutrition Foundation in partnership with AHDB. So AHDB bring all the sort of where food comes from and the farming information, and that couples nicely with the British Nutrition Foundation's nutrition and cooking expertise. So this is our programme, and it's been around for over 30 years now, and we produce materials that support the curriculum, or in this case the early years foundation stage curricula, and sort of UK equivalents, and so helping people, you know, to deliver the curricula wherever they are. So the kind of resources we have on Food, A Fact to Life, some people may have explored before, but if you haven't, these are just some of the sorts of materials that we have on the website. Our site isn't gated, so anyone can go in and use the resources, print them out, show them on screen, however they'd like to do that, completely free. And I say you've got that sort of reassurance that they do tie in with what's in the early years curricula as well. So they have things like, you know, lots of food cards, lots of very visual, colourful food cards, nice recipes for working with young children, and then also kind of advice as well for early years educators, so on tasting and charts like reward charts and so on. So this is just how we organise our materials. So you can see a sort of screen grab of the website there, and if you went into the 3 to 5 years, you'll see a drop down, and we have kind of 3 key themes that go the whole way across the website from age 3 right up to 16, and those are healthy eating, cooking, and where food comes from. So those are always run all the way through. So there are resources to build up children's healthy eating, cooking, and where food comes from knowledge and skills. And then we also have extra areas as well. So we've got a food commodities area where we look in a bit more detail at, you know, how different food is grown and produced for us to eat. And then also we have an activities pack area. So I'm going to just whistle through a few different examples of the materials that are in those areas, just so you know what to look out for if you're browsing through. And I say, when you get this presentation, there are links in this as well, so you'll be able to jump straight through to some of the materials. So healthy eating, we've got lots of lovely images of different foods, and these are great. They can be up on display. The children can have a look at them. They can sort them, perhaps by colours or by shapes, or they're great as well for a discussion. You know, have you tried this before? You know, what does this look like? What else do, you know, other comparable foods, etc. And we've also got cut and stick foods, and a sort of a food tasting book as well, where the children can sort of taste and draw or cut and stick foods they've tried, and you use a smiley face to sort of review those. And it sort of really supports children becoming more familiar with different kind of you know, different foods, and thinking about them before they actually reach the lunch table or the meal table. So they've already had a little bit of experience of that. So some of our other healthy eating resources here. So we've got a very simple version of the Eat Well Guide poster. So obviously most people are probably familiar with the more fuller version, but we've done a really stripped back version, so children can start to have a look, you know, what foods belong in different food groups, you know, which food groups are the biggest, you know, and what does this mean? You know, we've got a really big fruit and vegetable group there. This means we need more foods from this group, you know, quite a large amount of those foods from that group in what we eat, and then smaller groups maybe a little bit less, and getting them more familiar with, you know, kind of what belongs where. And we've got a nice game here as well, where they work in a group of 4, and you cut out the food pictures on the right hand side there, put them face down in the middle, and they take it in turns to take a food, and they have a copy of this Eat Well Guide game each, and they try and put a food or a drink in the right place on their game. And I say it's all about really just getting them familiar with food, talking about it, talking about them and getting familiar with how they look, etc. So here's a few resources on thinking about cooking. So we've got some that look at sort of getting ready to cook, you know, tying back hair, rolling up sleeves. So those basic hygiene steps, encouraging children to think about, you know, hygienic behaviour, keeping themselves hygienic, washing their hands. And then we've got lots of lovely, say, visual resources again for looking at different pieces of equipment or things they might find in the kitchen or they might be working with. So these might be used again for displays or discussion. We've got jigsaws as well, where they put the pieces of equipment together. So they're practicing, so the language, learning more about what things are called, and generally becoming more familiar. And then into our sort of third main theme, which is where food comes from. So again, you can probably imagine the kind of resources in here. So we've got, you know, again, imagery that looks at foods from different seasons, and also these where food comes from cards, which show, you know, different foods and then them in situ while they're growing, so that you can have discussions about, you know, potatoes growing underground, and then maybe move on to planting some of these, you know, vegetables yourself, and getting the children involved with that, and seeing how they grow, and what they're like when they're ready to eat. And then just to give you an example of one of our activity packs, so we've got these 6 early years activity packs. So we basically took 6 sort of themes and we tied them in with areas of the early years curricula, ones that were sort of common around the UK. And actually, I say my background is actually in primary teaching, and at BNF we work across the UK, and in different parts of the UK there are different curricula and subjects are called slightly different names, and things like that. But actually what was really interesting when I was doing this work, putting together these packs, is that actually the early years kind of areas of learning and development are across the UK are actually really, really similar. So it's the most similar, you know, age phase for curriculum than anything else. So we came with these different sort of themes and we tied them into different areas of the early years curricula. So for example, you can see amazing allotments there, and we've tied that in with maths and counting from 1 to 10. And we've also weaved those in with our themes on the website as well. So our health, eating, cooking, where food comes from. And this is just a little bit more of a slightly closer look at what resources we've got here. So we've got some session notes to tell you how to sort of approach this. And as I said already, this is to do with maths and numeracy, and tying in with where food comes from. So it's all focused around looking at allotment. So the resources all come in a sort of a slide deck or a PowerPoint presentation, and it's got all the lovely images in it and the different activities as well. So you can see there's pictures of different, like the tomatoes there, different vegetables, and the children can name those and count them. There's an allotment board which forms a bit of a game, rolling a dice, counting, colouring in different vegetables, a sheet to take home so they can talk to their family a little bit about what they've been learning. So those are just some of the key resources we have in early years. And just on the right there, you'll see we've got an early years drop-in. So this was a session that I did, I think, just at the end of last year, looking at, again, touring in a bit more detail some of our early years resources. So if you want to find out a bit more about those, you could take a look at that. And obviously you can follow the links and you know, have an explore yourself too. And then just to make you aware that we've got a newsletter that comes out once a month, and whenever we have any new materials or things or events, we put that in the newsletter. So you might want to sign up for that, and you can sign up for that on the homepage at Food A Factor Life. And then we've also got an X, formerly Twitter, account where we quite often post about our materials to remind people or to showcase new ones. And then you're very welcome, of course, to get in touch with us. You can email me directly, or we've got an education email as well, which is just education@nutrition.org.uk. So I think I will stop there, and I'm going to come back to the questions in a second, but I just wanted to remind everybody when we do finish that it'd be great if you could do a quick evaluation of the webinar. So there's the QR there. I'll give you a moment if you want to scan that now so it's ready, and then my colleague Francis or Orla will pop a link into the evaluation as well afterwards. So we'll go back to questions, and we'll just have a look through the chat box. If there's anything you'd like to ask, now is your chance. You can pop it in the chat box, or we may be able to unmute you. I'm not sure on the technology there. Okay, shall we have Catherine? I don't know if you've been looking through and you've picked anything out there.
Yeah, let's have a look. There's some great questions coming in. So I'm just looking at the Q&A box. Denny Isabel has asked about children who are pre-verbal or have SEND needs. And I imagine, Denny, you are asking about sort of this approach to feeding for those particular children. It's a great question. And actually what I would say is those children perhaps need a little bit more bespoke kind of one-to-one approach, but essentially everything that I've talked about in the presentation is appropriate for those children as well. It is as I say, it's a case of trying to understand those children's bespoke individual circumstances and their accepted foods. A childcare environment can be really helpful for some of those children, because even though they may not be ready to explore new foods themselves, they might still be benefiting from the role modelling of peers and staff around them. With that family style approach serving, they are still benefiting from exposure to those foods in the centre of the table. So I wouldn't necessarily say that any of those strategies don't apply to a SEND child. I would say actually they're probably even more important. And it would be a case of working very closely with that family, finding out what their accepted foods are at home and trying to make sure that some of those are around. It depends on the degree of food refusal for that child. So it's a bit more on a case-by-case basis. But just as you would be making adjustments for any child who had to avoid certain foods for a dietary requirement need, there might also be adjustments we need to make for SEND children as well. So I hope that helps to answer your question. It's difficult to know without sort of understanding fully each child's situation, but certainly those strategies would be applicable as well.
Thanks, Catherine. That's really helpful. I've seen there's another interesting question from Jane here about the number of food items in a lunchbox. Just before, I'll hand that to you, Catherine, but just before, I was just going to jump to Karen's question. Karen asked if there was an Eat Well guide for other cultures. So there isn't an official one from the OHID Department for Health, but I have seen some schools using different ones, and they said they've got them from the NHS website, so that you could have a look on there and see if you can find those ones on there. So Catherine, shall I hand back to you with the number of items in a lunchbox question from Jane?
Yeah. Absolutely. So this question from Jane: we have lunchboxes brought in from home, even though we ask for 3 or 4 items only and share with them healthy lunchbox ideas. We do get many highly processed, high salt, sugar and fat products. Is it okay to say savoury foods first? And how can we get more parents sending in less choices? This is a really great question, and lunchboxes is incredibly difficult to manage in a setting. So I know probably a lot of you are having to deal with that, particularly in smaller settings or preschools or as childminders. I think it's a great idea to have a lunchbox policy. You might be aware that there is some new guidance from the Department for Education around nutrition, so new EYFS nutrition guidance, which is coming into place in September. I would use that as a really good opportunity to strengthen your food policies or to strengthen your lunchbox policy, and really sort of talk to parents about those choices. And that's something that is going to support you in your commitment to those new guidance from the EYFS as well. Obviously, there's only so much you can do, and you have to deal with what foods are brought in. So I think it is a case of trying to continually have those conversations with the parents. In terms of saying savoury foods first, you can do that if you want to. Again, I think it really depends on the child and the circumstances. My initial sort of the difficulty with doing that, and sometimes thinking about this bigger picture of the relationship with food, is that if we say, you have to eat all the savoury foods first before you have the sweet foods, we sort of put the sweet foods or those more sort of highly processed foods up on a bit of a pedestal, and we say it's almost indicating you've got to get through all this first before you can get to the good stuff. We create a bit of a hierarchy of food. So from that respect, I would potentially avoid those kind of conversations and allow children, if it's lunchboxes, we're not talking about family style serving here, allowing them to eat what they want from their lunchboxes, continuing to have those conversations with parents and carers, maybe having conversations about specific foods with the parents rather than with the children about what you don't want to see or what's not compliant with the guidance. And this piece of guidance might help you, might facilitate those conversations, because now there is an expectation to stick to that guidance. So that might reinforce some of those messages. I think what is also helpful is to talk to the children about variety. So without demonizing foods or without sort of creating that hierarchy of foods, we can talk to children about how your tummy needs lots of different things inside it. So if you find that children are constantly going for just the carbs or just the very sweet foods and they're ignoring the piece of fruit or salad or vegetables that's in their lunchbox or it's on the table, that's where a lot of the resources that Claire has talked about from Food A Fact of Life are going to be really helpful to facilitate some of those conversations and that sort of variety message without putting too much pressure on and without demonizing foods. It takes time, but it's a really good way to start with some of those food activities, with some of those conversations about variety and how that's important. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Claire.
No, I think that was superb what you said there, Catherine. Yeah, that's excellent. I think we're just a few minutes over time, but there is one more question. Perhaps we could ask you, Catherine, before we close. So this is from Barbara, who says, my concern is that encouraging complete autonomy by allowing a child to choose what they want to eat from the choices on the table is not going to help children choose appropriate portion sizes and children who wouldn't choose to eat any veg or salad. You got any tips or ideas there, Catherine?
Yeah, that's a really good point as well. And I think similarly to that sort of that variety conversation, we can be doing that through food education in terms of encouraging children to understand what fruits and vegetables are and make fruits and vegetables appealing by not putting pressure on them to eat those foods. Sometimes that reluctance to try fruits and vegetables or to go for the fruits and vegetables comes because they're feeling the pressure to always try those. That's the foods that we want them to eat because we know they are particularly healthy. And so that no pressure approach can actually, although in the interim you might find that children, when they're given control and autonomy, they might always go for the carbohydrates, for example, and ignore the fruits and vegetables. Research shows that it does pay off, and that non-pressure approach actually helps them to enjoy fruits and vegetables more in the long term, and they're making the choices to do it rather than being pressured to accept the fruits and vegetables. So it's a bit of a mindset shift, but it can really help that long-term goal of generating that positive relationship with food. What happens is eventually we have intrinsic motivation to want to eat those foods. So the child is actually internally very curious of those foods. There's no pressure to try them. They're doing it of their own accord, and that's what we're aiming to achieve. In terms of the portion sizes, that's a really good point as well. And I think that we're talking about, you provide, the child decides how much. There has to be boundaries around that if you are serving foods in your setting. So I think rather than saying, oh, you've had too much rice now, or you've had too much bread, you need to put something else on your plate, thinking about your language when it comes to those conversations is really important. So rather than saying you've had too much, you could talk about how it's important to make sure that there's enough for all of our friends as well. So that bringing that sharing aspect into it is again a really helpful way that reinforces that family style serving And rather than sort of saying to that child they've had too much, it's about making sure that there's enough to go around for everybody else as well. So yes, we can sort of put boundaries around portion sizes from that respect, would be my suggestion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Catherine. Really wonderful to get all your expertise there, and just so much information you've shared with us. I think I'll be going back through your slides again and looking at everything there. It's just really fantastic. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's a pleasure. There's so much to cover, isn't there? Such a short space of time. But if anybody does have any questions beyond today, please feel free to reach out. We sort of scratched the surface slightly.
Yes. So do reach out to Catherine, or you can get in touch with us at the British Nutrition Foundation at education@nutrition.org.uk, and we'll either direct questions to Catherine, or if they're for us, we'll answer those as well.